Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to RRS Live. My name is Mackenzi Barrett, and I am a junior in the Randall Research Scholars Program. This semester, I conducted research under the mentorship of Dr. Reka Nath in the University of Alabama's Department of Philosophy. My research focused on the connection between state autonomy rights and immigration. As many of you are probably aware, immigration has become an increasingly contentious topic, both in the political and social spheres. For starters, open borders are simply not the reality. Every state has some form of border control, even if their borders are not completely closed. Additionally, there are increasing numbers of refugees around the world. Estimates tend to be in the tens of millions, although it really just depends on how one defines refugee. In the United States, there is a severe green card backlog. In fact, the US State Department is still processing visa applications from the 1990s. On the screen, you can see a flowchart of the green card application process. You can see it's extremely complicated, so there's no surprise that there is such a backlog, given the administrative burden of this process. And finally, there is large interest in moving to another country. According to one poll, 750 million, or approximately 15% of the world's adult population, would like to move to a different country. With all of this in mind, my research aimed to address the question, do states actually have a right to control their borders? If the answer was no, then immigration policies around the world would have to drastically change such that open borders actually would be the reality. To begin to address this question, I first conducted a literature review, looking at journal articles and books on immigration-related topics, which were for the most part philosophically related. I also looked at facts about immigration around the world and in the US, such as the ones mentioned on the previous slide. I'd like to point out that philosophy research differs significantly from research in other disciplines. For the most part, philosophers are not going out into the world, conducting experiments, collecting data, and drawing conclusions from that data. Instead, in the analytical tradition common in the United States, philosophers craft arguments and critique the arguments of other philosophers, determining whether these arguments are valid, meaning that the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, and/or sound, meaning that the argument is both valid and the premises are true such that the conclusion is also true. This is exactly how I addressed my own research, with the goal of producing a publishable journal article. My starting point and the argument that I began with critiquing was from a 2008 article written by Christopher Heath Wellman called Immigration and Freedom of Association. The argument in this article is further elaborated on in a book that Wellman co-authored with Andrew Altman called A Liberal Theory of International Justice. They begin with the premise that states have a right to autonomy or self-determination, which I will be discussing further on a later slide. From this right to self-determination, they also have a right to freedom of association. In other words, freedom of association is a component of the right to self-determination. By freedom of association, Altman and Wellman mean that states have a right to associate, to not associate, and to disassociate. A common analogy is that of marriage, such that I have a right to marry whomever I want, I have a right to reject a marriage proposal, and I have a right to get a divorce. From this freedom of association, Altman and Wellman conclude that every legitimate state has the right to close its borders to all potential immigrants, even refugees that are desperately seeking asylum from corrupt political regimes, and those from states who are either unwilling or unable to protect the basic moral rights of its citizens. To begin critiquing this argument, I first began by asking what the purpose of a state is. First, I identified what Altman and Wellman mean by a legitimate state. A legitimate state is a state that protects the rights of its constituents and respects the rights of everyone else, according to Altman and Wellman. From there, I worked backwards to determine that the purpose of a state is to protect the basic rights of those under its control. This purpose has implications for the rights that a state has against outsiders. And by outsiders, I mean not only individuals outside of the state, but also other states. Furthermore, when determining what rights a state has, we have to determine whether that right is necessary for the state to be able to fulfill its purpose. The first right that I considered then was self-determination. Now, there are a couple potential conceptions of state self-determination. The first is that of non-intervention and self-rule. Non-intervention simply means that there is a duty on other states not to intervene in the affairs of a legitimate state. And self-rule is the other half to the same coin and simply means that a state has a right to rule itself. The other potential conception is that of self-composition, which means that a state has a right to control its membership or to control who is a member of that state. Now, of these potential conceptions, the one that would lead to Altman and Wellman's conclusion, in other words, lead to the exclusion of all potential immigrants, is self-composition. However, when considering this against the purpose of the state, it turns out that self-composition is not necessary for the state to fulfill its purpose. All that is necessary is the conception of non-intervention and self-rule. However, this proper conception does not allow Altman and Wellman to draw their conclusion. Instead, I considered whether there were any rights associated with the state's territory, territorial rights, which may allow Altman and Wellman to draw their conclusion. So the territorial rights that I considered were first, the right to jurisdiction, which simply means that a state's laws apply to everybody within that territory, and the right to control movement across borders, which pertains to both goods and people. Once again, comparing this to the purpose of a state, I determined that neither of these territorial rights includes a right to exclude all outsiders. Instead, the right to exclude is limited to only those individuals whose entry into the state would inhibit the state's ability to fulfill its purpose or protect the rights of those under its control. Lastly, I considered the impact that coercion would have on the state's ability to control its borders. Coercion occurs when one agent successfully executes a set of actions such that another agent acts in accordance with the first agent's intentions contrary to her own intentions. So for example, suppose I am a 6-year-old at the dinner table and I have a plate full of vegetables that I hate in front of me, and I don't want to eat them under any circumstances. But my mom tells me that unless I eat my vegetables, that I'm not going to be able to play with my favorite toy anymore. So with that threat, I eat the vegetables. This is an example of coercion. And it turns out that under the same definition, the state also coerces all potential immigrants, both those that do attempt to enter the state and those that do not even bother. That state's coerced potential immigrants has implications for the legitimacy of the state. According to Altman and Wellman, for a state to be legitimate, they must justify this coercion to those being coerced. So either they justify the coercion, which turns out to contradict the right to self-determination, which Altman and Wellman would not want, or they can eliminate the coercion completely. In other words, they can open up their borders. What this means is that contrary Altman and Wellman, states do not have a right to exclude all potential immigrants. Instead, this right to exclude is very limited and in fact only applies to individuals whose entry into the state would inhibit the state's ability to fulfill its purpose. And at this point in time, I open it up to any questions.
Mackenzi, would your conclusion have changed if state self-determination did include a right for self-composition?
Right. So if Altman and Wellman were correct in their conception of self-determination as self-composition, then they would be able to draw their conclusion based on that conception. However, recall that I said that coercion has implications for the legitimacy of a state, and only a legitimate state has a right to self-determination. And because this coercion is not justified to the ones that are being coerced, the potential immigrants, no state with any form of border control is actually legitimate, which means even if the right to self-determination includes a right to self-composition, no state would actually have that right to self-determination. So Altman and Wellman's conclusion wouldn't actually apply to any state anyway.
So what are some of the, why do you focus on the purpose of the state rather than its legitimacy?
That's a great question. So recall that the purpose of a state is simply to fulfill the basic rights of those under its control. To be legitimate, a state has to fulfill its purpose, but a state can also be legitimate and go beyond its purpose. So for example, say a state decides to ensure that everybody has some minimum level of wealth that's doing more than protecting the basic rights, but the state's still legitimate. But when we're considering the rights that a state has outside of the state, so against outsiders, we have to look to the purpose, which is more basic. And I think the best way to explain this is to look at an analogy. So if you're a parent, you have a duty to protect your child, and any rights that you have against people that are outside of that relationship have to do with the relationship and the duty you have to your child, such that if someone were harming my child, I would have a right against them to prevent them from harming my child. But for example, I wouldn't be able to tell them how to raise their child because that's not a right I would have because it's outside of my relationship with my own child. In the same way that a state has a specific relationship with those under its control that it doesn't have with those outside of its control.
Well done. Thank you for the great presentation, and also a special thanks to Dr. Knapp for joining us today. Thank you both.